Evening and welcome to the CIV Broadcast Day 2. My name is Ivan, that's Nadia.
And here's what's coming up.
Coming up tonight, Rachel talks to Michael Portillo.
I mean, it strikes me, I'm sorry not to give you a chance to reply at the moment, Paul. And its largest coastal town. What do we want?
We look at activism from several viewpoints, and we do a piece on Ukraine.
Up first, Ivan caught up with a foreign correspondent who chaired the panel on Ukraine.
Hi guys, my name is Ivan and my guest today is Jen Stout, journalist, writer and sound producer.
You're a journalist who has written quite a few articles about the war in Ukraine since its beginning. What was your reaction to the beginning of the war and how did you feel at that moment?
Yes, I remember very, very clearly because I was stepping off a plane in Gorno-Altaysk in the heart of Siberia. I was on a program living in Moscow, on a program for foreigners, journalists and business people, and learning Russian yes. And suddenly, I mean, we knew it was coming, of course, but you have to imagine like being in Russia in these months in the lead up to it was such a strange experience because of all this double speak and people saying, oh, it's nothing, this is just some imagination of America, of CNN, you're being hysterical. I mean, I thought there would be a war and I thought that we should leave. And so when I got off this plane, turned on my phone and my friends in Kharkiv were telling me they're dropping bombs on us because it was right at that time.
Now, after 1.5 years, do you agree that the community is, quote, pretty tired of Ukraine?
There's a problem of propaganda, especially among parts of the left, which are still quite Stalinist in the UK. Yeah, and there's a problem of fatigue generally. There's a sort of weariness and, oh, it's going on too long. I always ask these people, what do you think the alternative is? What do you propose Ukrainians should do? Should they just give up? Of course not. It's not possible. It's not an option. And I try to remind people that the war would be over tomorrow, today. All it would take is for Russia to withdraw its troops from the sovereign nation which it invaded. I do try to keep up awareness. When I'm in the UK, I try to do talks and maybe photo exhibitions just to remind people, keep some money flowing to volunteer organisations in Ukraine because I know that the money has gone down. Yeah.
You have mentioned that you have friends in Kharkiv and that yesterday you said that they are creative people, artists, musicians and so on. How are they doing?
They're incredible people, amazing people. I tell you, yeah, like I went to back to Kharkiv in the end of April, I think, or early May last year. And so there's lots of heavy shelling still in the city. The destruction was terrible, really, to see this beautiful, the architecture of Kharkiv is so beautiful in this city that I love so much. And the bombing in the centre, of course, was so heavy in March especially. But there in a bunker are my friends, they're reading poetry, live streaming it to a club in Berlin to raise money. They were playing music, playing the accordion, my favourite instrument. I just thought I'd gone to heaven, you know, because there was so much joy and solidarity in that room. I was just full of awe and respect for them. And what I learned from that, especially important, is they were raising money for the army. Is not for us, like when you say the army in Britain, it sounds like some distant army. For them, this was like TRO. It was the territorial defence who don't have enough weapons, they don't have enough equipment, and it was their cousins, their dads, their mothers, their brothers in the TRO defending Kharkiv. So it's as real as it gets. How are they now? I mean, they keep going somehow. It's hard. It's hard, but of course they have no option. So they keep going, they keep spirits up. We've lost good friends, they've lost great friends, some beautiful people have been killed. Every person is beautiful, you know, but when it's this one guy is a sculptor, a musician, just beloved to many people, and those losses are very hard to bear.
Yeah. You mentioned Russian propaganda before. Do you think it's like effective in Western countries and in Scotland particularly?
Russians are very good at propaganda. They've been doing it for a very long time. It's essentially still the KGB model, you know, sow confusion, make people doubt everything. So many times, the most common thing I hear is people saying, I just don't know what to trust, I don't know who to trust, I don't trust the BBC, I don't trust journalists. You know, obviously as a journalist this is quite annoying, but this is the most effective form of propaganda, is people just saying, it's too confusing. And actually that's very insidious, because yes, it's messy, but it's not confusing. It's very simple. A sovereign nation was invaded by a proto-fascist country. It's quite simple.
That seemed like an interesting panel to see. The war in Ukraine is something that has come up a lot at the festival. Yesterday I went to see Is the West in Decline, where they also discussed international involvement in Ukraine. Here's what some of the panel members had to say.
Do you think that Western involvement is sufficient? Are we providing enough support?
The answer to that, I think, is no, if we want Ukraine to prevail. The Ukrainians at the moment are trying to do something which is almost unprecedented in modern warfare, and that is to punch a hole through fixed defenses in depth without air superiority. And in order for the Ukrainians to have success, they're going to have to be able to draw on Western air power, and that's a very tricky issue. But I don't see a way for the Ukrainians to succeed in the way that most NATO countries want the Ukrainians to succeed without the provision of quite substantial air power to allow them to control the skies over the area where they're trying to make headway with a ground offensive. I think Putin is counting on war weariness and perhaps the advent of a different administration in Washington to undermine Western support for Ukraine. And I think he's counting on Russia's ability to stick things out. And this is why I think the Ukrainians felt under quite a lot of pressure to make headway with their offensive this summer, because who knows what the political context in places like Washington will be like in 18 months' time.
So now I'm joined with Dr. Matea. Just wondering, what do you think are the main benefits of looking at non-Western approaches to conflict management?
So non-West has been involved in conflict management for a very, very long time. It's just we haven't been paying attention to it. Quite a lot of conflicts in the past, sort of even during the time of sort of liberal international order, sort of immediately after the end of the Cold War, were actually managed by non-Western powers, usually regional powers. So a lot of the conflicts in Africa would be managed through regional organizations in Africa or neighboring states. But what we are actually seeing now is kind of an even bigger diversification of conflict management, where countries from sort of, for example, in the Horn of Africa, a lot of the time it will be the Gulf states that get involved. China will be at the table, in addition to sort of liberal Western states. And I think that, to an extent, potentially brings sort of the challenge is always then coordination, who gets to lead, who gets to set the agenda for a lot of the conflict management, but it potentially also brings new ideas, particularly in places where West has been discredited, sort of has lost legitimacy. And one of the examples that I like giving is, for example, now in Ukraine, a lot of the peace initiatives, they're not ready to be sort of accepted by the parties, but a lot of the peace initiatives are coming from countries such as India, Brazil, African states, right? So they're not coming from Western countries per se. The only sort of successful initiative in Ukraine has been brokered by Turkey with the help of the UN, but it's been Turkey that did it. So I think it allows the space for parties to potentially accept different sort of mediators in a lot of the context. But on the other hand, there is a fear in the West that means that they will lose some of the power in sort of how the agenda is set.
I'm now joined by Tony. Do you think international organizations have an important place in tackling global issues?
Absolutely. I think international organizations are actually essential to tackling global issues. In a lot of regions in the world, they have greater legitimacy than individual countries. And I think when we sort of think about the countries that tend to have power to intervene, they've not left a good taste, I would say, in the mouths of a lot of those countries that they're intervening in. So when you think about organizations like the African Union, its role is quite significant in the African region. Right now in the Sahel, the ECOWAS seems to have a significant role because they have a better understanding of the local dynamics, but also they're more invested, or they feel more invested in the conflict. And there's a sense that with greater investment, there's a tendency to search for more options, perhaps, than if you didn't have as much of an investment. In Europe, we tend to talk, of course, a lot about the European Union itself. But in doing that, when we talk about the European Union, when we talk about NATO, we also forget other significant international organizations like the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This is the largest regional organization in the world. It does a lot of work around peace mediation, peace building, and a lot of conflicts that have been simmering or have been going on for a really long time that we're not paying attention to. So I do think international organizations have a significant role. Unfortunately, they're not all resourced in the same ways. So of course, we know that the UN is probably the most famous international organization. And if you speak to people who work for the UN, they will say that, the resourcing could be better, but actually there are a lot of other organizations that are funded even less than the United Nations. So I think it's not a question of whether, they're useful. They certainly are for a variety of reasons, but they're not resourced as they need to be in order to tackle some of the global challenges we find today.
So now I'm joined with Rachel. What do you think about international involvement in the war in Ukraine?
I think we've definitely seen involvement from loads of countries in the EU and part of the G12 committee. Obviously we've sent medical supplies and basic reinforcements and helping there, but there is more that can be done and there always will be. We've seen that the United States sent air weaponry, but however it did not match to the level of technology that Russia has, and we need to be able to help them more instead of sending that. But I think that we will definitely see in the next general election that Ukraine will be a big decision in people's votes.
Yeah, definitely. So you had an interesting interview today too.
Yes, I had the experience of interviewing Michael Portillo, and here's how it went.
Hello, today I'm joined by former Conservative Cabinet member Michael Portillo. So Michael, why don't you tell the people at home a bit about yourself and why you felt it was important to come to the Festival of Politics and talk?
About myself, I was indeed in the Cabinet. I was a member of the UK Parliament off and on for about 18 years, I think. And as my political career came to an end, I began to develop a media career. And the two principal elements of that were I used to participate in a political programme which was weekly. It was called This Week. It was a sardonic look back at the week in politics, and that ran on BBC One for 16 years. And almost as long-lived as that, for the last 15 years, I've been making railway journeys for BBC Two, and they so far have taken me to 5 different continents, and there have been many hundreds of programmes.
Yeah, so obviously you've had an extensive time doing all the train journeys. You also have strong connections to Scotland with your mother being Scottish and your grandparents. I believe I read an article that said when you were younger that you'd travel up on the sleeper train. Do you think that inspired your love of trains?
I didn't travel up on the sleeper train. I travelled on the overnight train, sitting bolt upright in the seat. So it wasn't particularly inspiring of a love of trains. But I was indeed travelling with my mother, who'd been born in Kirkcaldy. I was going to see my grandfather, who was from Kirkcaldy. My grandmother actually was English. She was from Cheshire, but she lived obviously in Kirkcaldy. And the journeys were memorable, and joking apart, crossing the Forth Rail Bridge, which one would do, at 7 in the morning or something, was absolutely memorable. It is, I still think it's the greatest bridge that I've ever encountered.
As a train enthusiast yourself, what's been a unique or interesting cultural tradition that you've experienced on your travels whilst doing great railway journeys?
Gosh, that's a difficult one. Just off the top of my head, I'm going to say that traveling in Georgia, which is the country to the south of Russia, I'd never encountered anywhere that was so in love with wine. It seemed that everybody was into winemaking. They didn't seem to make wine the way I've seen wine being made elsewhere. Somehow they seemed to be able to make it in a sort of jug or pot or vessel of some kind. And it seemed that almost everyone in Georgia was into winemaking. Even if they had a small flat, they'd have a sort of bucket sitting in the shower room or the bathroom. So I was quite impressed by that. And I went to a lovely wedding in Georgia. They're famous for their food and for their hospitality, and also for their singing. So the men, bearded men in traditional costume, sing repeatedly during the wedding, short snatches with great deep voices, and you know, it was all helped along by the Georgian wine as well. It was a great experience.
So that must have been very interesting to interview him and to hear all about his career.
Yes, he was definitely a character. But I believe that you also got the opportunity to sit down with someone else who's quite big in the political world and maybe a different aspect.
Yeah, now we'll be showing the second part of my interview with Liz Lloyd from yesterday. What advice would you give to anyone interested in a career in policymaking or in politics in general?
Just get in and do it. So, I mean, I don't think there's a set path. So it's not like you have to have a degree in politics or you have to have a degree in policy. The best way, I think, to do it is to be involved in campaigns, to be active, not even in, you don't have to be active in a political party, but to be active and involved in things that you are interested in. And that way you can build experience. And where then if you go to politicians or you go to the civil service or you come to the parliament, you've got a track record of what you've done. Because what people look for when you're hiring a new person into politics is someone who's got a bit of oomph about them, who's got a bit of a little bit of an attitude, a bit of get up and go, who's going to be really enthusiastic. Because it's not an easy job and it has really long hours, so you have to really care about the kind of things that you want to do.
So we're here reporting on the Festival of Politics that's taking place in the Parliament over the next few days. Obviously, we'll be discussing a range of issues. What do you think are the biggest issues the world is facing today? We've maybe touched on that a little bit.
We have a little bit. I think I think there's two others in politics that are really interesting right now and that we haven't, which is technology. Mm-hmm. So how AI is going to impact how services are delivered, and how it's going to impact how governments and politicians can run things, the sort of information you have, access to data and what you do with that, but also what services in the future are going to be delivered by technology as opposed to people, and then how do you support those people to do something else? And then I think the other one is that there's a real risk at the moment to democracy, not in a like we won't have a democracy way, but in the sense of misinformation and people manipulating what's being said. A lot of what you see on social media, people kind of ignoring facts and evidence and creating their own versions of the truth because that suits their political end. And we need to find a way, and I don't think we know what it is yet, to tackle that so that people can have open, honest discussions that are based on fact and not be misled into supporting something that maybe isn't good for them.
Yeah, I think the panel discussions on those two topics will be really interesting. So do you think young people are connected with politics? And if not, why, and what could be done to include more young people?
I think young people are hugely political, but not in a party political way. So I think you get a lot of campaigns, a lot of issue campaign politics, so around the climate, for example, that are led by young people, and where young people have really strong voices and have a huge amount to contribute. I think the challenge in politics, if you think of the system, the parliament, the politicians, is connecting what happens in a building like the parliament to the issues that young people are really caring about, and connecting what happens in a building like this to what opportunities young people have in the future. So I think you want as many young people involved as possible. I think young people learning in school and colleges and universities about the role of the parliament, what it does, how it affects their lives, but also and I think we've done this quite well in Scotland, but we could do more, being really invited to have a say and knowing that politicians are listening to their voices. And quite often in politics, you get a sort of age divide where older people vote. So politicians can be led to do the things that are really good for the older people and ignore the things that would be really good for younger people. So the more noise young people make and the more young people say, we're going to vote, so you need to deliver what we want, then the more politicians will have to respond.
So you've had a very long and successful career at the Scottish Government. Do you think your future career will always centre on politics, or are you keen to maybe like branch out to something else?
I can't imagine not at least having an eye on what's happening, like always sort of having a hand in. It might not be what I do as my main job, like 24/7, but I think I'll always be involved and around. I think when you're interested in politics, you can never walk away.
So yeah, thank you for taking the time to come in and doing this interview. It's been great to hear about your time at the Scottish Government.
Thank you for that, Erin. I think I think Liz Lloyd touched a very important point there, and I'd like to say that I think that's how young people engage with politics, isn't it, Gail?
Oh, definitely, I agree. But me and Jake explored this point from a number of different angles today, speaking to a young climate activist this morning and then later panellists from today's talk on activism. Last week, I witnessed climate activist group This Is Rigged protesting here at the entrance to the Parliament building. This morning, we had the privilege of speaking to Rowena, a young climate activist. So why is it you think that young people are turning more towards activism as opposed to conventional politics?
I mean, because it's at a drastic stage at the moment with the climate crisis. Like, we're seeing it everywhere on the news all the time. Like, just this morning I had a notification about like more wildfires in Hawaii with like more than 30 people dying. Like, it's everywhere. We've seen like in Greece, like literally like people are being like displaced, and obviously we know in the global south like it's even worse. Like, it's just so drastic right now.
Do you think it's becoming more and more necessary to grab the attention of policymakers with just big protest action, like we saw perhaps at the Parliament like a week ago?
Nowadays, like, I used to do things like petitions and marches and so on and things, and like they're great, but like they just don't get the attention that's needed. Like, this needs to be disruptive or destructive, honestly, and like it needs to be like, yeah. So like the stuff that happened at the Parliament with like This Is Rigged, like that was great.
Hi, I'm Jake from SIF, and today I'm here with Erin Waldy. So Erin, you talked a lot in your panel about protesting. So I'm just here to ask, the protest that happened here last week, last Tuesday, that we got to get footage for. What was your opinion on it?
So unfortunately, I wasn't really educated on what actually happened there, but I was on call with someone from the Scottish Parliament when they were happening. So, but I still think protests are so important in the political system, because even if they start out peace, a lot of the time protests will start out peaceful and they don't get the media attention. So people will have to resort to those violent ways of protesting in order to get media attention.
Is that maybe why you feel the need for young people to participate in politics in like those sort of ways instead of voting?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think young people should be involved in politics any way they can, and protests are such an easy way to do it. Same with petitions, especially in the Scottish Parliament, because you only need one signature, which in like the UK Parliament, you need 100,000 signatures to get through to Parliament. So especially in Scotland, it's such an important way to get involved in politics, and it's usually people's way in because they see, oh, there's a protest happening with this issue. I'm really interested in that issue. I'm going to go to this protest.
So in the talk, you mentioned something interesting about losers' consent, about the need for people to sort of accept outcomes in the system for democracy to kind of survive. But would that not be sort of difficult for those who disagree fundamentally with the system itself? We spoke to a member of This Is Rigged earlier, and it's system change that they want.
Absolutely. I think if you think that the big changes that are needed are system changes, and that's a good argument. The climate crisis can only be addressed, for example, if we engage with the economic system in many regards. The question is, how do you think you can achieve this? There are two routes. One is building majorities, potentially through external pressure and then through the political apparatus. The second is saying we overthrow the system, of course. Now, if you go down that second route, then you're challenging as well. But there are obviously a lot of actors who want to enact system change through the existing political mechanisms. So it's a really, really fundamental question of how you go about it. Most campaigns and activists want really fundamental change, but see the route to enactment ideally through those existing mechanisms.
You described how when parties themselves reached out to young people that they became more engaged. I feel, in terms of my perception, youth disengagement with conventional politics has been framed as a disinterest issue, but it's interesting flipping it onto the parties themselves, that it's something that can be overcome. Is that something, is that maybe a shining light for the future, that the young people can be brought into conventional politics? They just need the sort of helping hand, I guess.
I think I wouldn't even describe it as young people needing a helping hand, because young people are not less motivated to engage politically than in the past. There's some indications that young people are more engaged, but not necessarily, as you've said, through party political mechanisms. But all research shows that basically people who become engaged with non-conventional forms of engagement often are also ultimately more likely to vote, to become engaged in other ways. So what parties need to do is not, in a sense, help young people, but treat them seriously. Treat them as serious political actors that they often are. And the fundamental point is that's what we see when political parties don't start by saying, basically, you have to trust us more and engage with us and basically behave like we've behaved for the last 100 years. But instead say, we find it really interesting what you're doing here, tell us about it, and then we can tell you what we can offer. If it's a dialogue, that's the bigger potential. And we saw this in Scotland after the Scottish independence referendum, that those parties who actively reached out to under 18-year-olds, they basically had more support from them and more engagement. And they were on the independent supporting and opposing side. Some parties managed to create this. So the key thing is that it's outreach, but it needs to be genuine. It shouldn't just be basically a kind of fig leaf type thing.
And what a great spot about activism that was. But unfortunately, to all the viewers at home, that's all we've got for tonight.
Join us again tomorrow for our final show, where we will be discussing gender-based violence, Section 28, AI, and more.
From everyone at SIF, thank you and good night.